Okay, continuing on with the federalism lecture, this is going to be the second part. And so you will be using this part, the tools and the funding sources, as well as the next part of the lecture for your assignment, which is a short paper on a PBS video that you will be watching called The Storm. So pay attention to this one. Okay, so when I'm talking about these things, the questions that you should be asking yourself is that, there has been so much that is going on at the federal level, and I think I mentioned to you in the last lecture that federalism is also based on ideology. For example, the liberal ideology is that that the federal government handle a lot of the issues, or that they set up a lot of the standards, federal level standards. The conservative ideology is that it's called states' rights, that the states should be the ones to set up the standards for the population that they serve, their citizenry, in other words. All right, so then, since we have so many laws that do deal at the federal level or at the federal level with these federal level standards, then the question becomes, well, then how does the federal government coerce the states? How do they work with the states? And that's the next part of the lecture, these intergovernmental relations. How is it that the federal government engages the states in order for them to do whatever the federal government feels is best for the country and for the people living within each of the states? So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the learning objectives that include how federalism is actually implemented at the state levels. So we're going to be talking about the pillars of the Constitution, because everything that we do is based on the Constitution. We're going to be talking about this thing called regulatory federalism, or what tools do they have in order to engage the states. And we will be talking about the money part of it, the fiscal federalism. Because when we pay taxes, money goes to the federal government, but then the states get money back. And so how does that money get back, and what is it used for? What can it be used for? Okay, so when it comes to the Constitution itself, there's basically 4 pillars of the Constitution. And so this gives the federal government quite a bit of leeway to work with the states. And so of the 4, I'm only going to really talk about one, which is really the most important part for this particular course. And this is called the National Supremacy Article, or the National Supremacy Act, which is called the Supremacy Act. And so what that means is that if there are any laws at the state level or the municipal levels, or ordinances at the municipal level, that the that the national level laws are going to take precedent over all of these other ones. That's another way of saying that once it becomes a national level law, whatever your state wants to do, they're not going to be able to do it. Let me give you an example of this one. And this was actually a court order. It wasn't so much a law, and it's still not a law, but it has the same effect as this national supremacy article. So basically, this dealt with the same-sex marriages. And in the same-sex marriages, the issue was one of equity. And that's what they heard that case about, what the Supreme Court heard the case about. And so many states, including the state of Texas, passed state-level statutes or legislation saying that, like, for example, in the state of Texas, marriage is between a man and a woman. And so when it went to the Supreme Court and they heard it under the equity clause, one of those pillars of the Constitution, and so the Supreme Court ruled at that time that it was in violation of the equity clause. And so what happened because of that is that all of the state level pieces of legislation, and ours was actually a constitutional amendment in addition to being a piece of legislation, they were null and void. So in every single state, whereas before, if you got married in another state and you moved back to Texas, or you came back to Texas, that marriage would not be recognized as a valid marriage, because in Texas, marriage was between a man and a woman. Okay, that's the main constitutional pillar. Other than that, the other one that you need to know about is the necessary and proper clause, and that just basically says the legislature, or the Congress, I should say, the U.S. Congress and Senate can pass laws so that in order to help the people of the country. So if they see that there's an issue within the country, within our population, that needs to be addressed, whether it be a social issue or an economic issue, this necessary and proper clause gives them the ability to be able to pass laws to help with that problem, or to find a program for that problem, to fund that problem. Okay, the next one that I want to talk about is called regulatory federalism. So this is the question that says, well, okay, then we know that there's these constitutional pillars, and everything that we do in public administration is based on the Constitution, but what do they actually, how do they do it? How do they do it? Well, this thing called regulatory federalism is actually a way that the federal government says, we passed a lot of laws, and we have passed a lot of laws at the U.S. level, at the federal level. And so in order for states to comply with the national level standards, this is how the federal government does it. So you have a handout about that. It's called the Tools of Federalism, and it's just like a one-page handout. But so let's talk about this one. Okay, the first one I'm going to talk about is called cost-cutting requirements. And so this one says if people that are receiving any kind of federal money, they have to comply with certain programs that the U.S. government has. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. You know, if you've ever worked, and I'm sure many of you have worked, somewhere on that application, there is this one clause that says, we do not discriminate against race, color, creed, national origin. Okay, that's a Civil Rights Act. That's the first thing I'm talking about. And so what they're saying is that if you're going to be receiving federal money, then you must also engage in civil rights, or in a civil rights office, or have a civil rights program, and different businesses, and this includes private sector as well. Businesses may have like a smaller program, but they have to have something that's going to comply with these cross-cutting requirements. So it mandates compliances to anybody who is receiving federal money, and many private industries do get federal level grants. Okay, so if for some reason states are not in compliance with these federal level standards, there's a couple of ways that the federal government can force compliance. And the first one that I want to talk about is called partial preemption. And so what happened is that I call it nationalization of program standards, because we have so many laws at the federal level now, and most of these became laws in the 1970s, in the early 1970s. And the reason that they rose to the federal level is because the states were not doing a very good job of implementing their state laws in an equitable fashion. There was a lot of inequality, a lot of inequities within the state pieces of legislation and the way that they were implemented. So these federal laws will establish basic policies or basic standards, and they leave it to the states to administer them. And the best example I can give you of this one is like environmental policy. We have environmental standards, and the states have to comply to at least these standards. Some states may ask for a waiver to have a more strict standards, or higher level standards, and it's up to the federal government to decide whether or not they can receive that waiver. But all states have to meet at least a basic level of compliance. So let me give you an example of this one. For a while, Houston was extremely smoggy. They had high ozone layers. It was a non-attainment area. And they would switch on and off between Houston and LA being the smoggiest cities in the United States. And so the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, goes to our state level environmental agency, the TCEQ, Texas Commission for Environmental Quality, and says, hey, Texas, you have a problem. You have a very smoggy city. Your ozone levels are way too high in Houston, so y'all need to do something about it. So then Austin, the TCEQ in Austin, goes to the city of Houston and says, well, city of Houston, what are you going to do about all of this smog? How are you going to decrease this level of smog? And so they had to come up with a plan. And so they allow the cities to come up to the plan, and then with a plan. And then it goes back to the state level, and they will look at it and decide, yes, this is good or this is not good. And then from the state level, then go back to the federal level, and they will buy off on it or not buy off on it, depending on their level of compliance, or if they see that it's going to fix the problem, to a certain degree. No problem is ever fixed completely. All right, if there's an instance where they're saying these plans are not going to work, we need more compliance of some way, more enforcement, more stringent regulations or whatever. And if the cities and the states are not willing to comply with that, the federal government can come in and preempt them. That's called partial preemption. And basically, it's kind of like an oversight function, saying, hey, man, we're going to be watching you. But not only that, we're going to decrease your funding. And no state agency wants to have their funding decreased. Okay, if it gets to the point where they just cannot work with the states, the federal government cannot work with the states, then they will come in and they will completely take over the program. So it's a national government that completely preempts any kind of conflicting state and local activities. And they're able to do this based on two other clauses, these constitutional pillars. One is the supremacy clause that I talked about, and the other one is the commerce clause. And the commerce clause is basically saying it is impeding interstate commerce. Whatever you're doing is not going to be good for the country. So we need to take it over so that we can have commerce flow freely, and this includes the environment, because the environment is transjurisdictional. It just doesn't just stay in Texas, it just goes all over, right? So total preemption, believe me, that is definitely not a good thing. Okay, then there's another tool of regulatory federalism called crossover sanctions. And what these are is that it will sanction one program if the standards are not met in another program. You're saying, well, how do they do that? Okay, let me give you some examples for this one. It used to be a long time ago that this was a long time ago, back in the 90s. It changed in 1995, I think. But for a long time, from the 70s to about the 90s, so it was about 20 years. It was alleged that we were having a shortage in oil prices or in gasoline. And so the price of gasoline went from something like 30-some cents to like maybe $1.50, which at that time was a lot of money. But the reason that they did that was to conserve energy, to conserve petroleum. And the way that they did it, this crossover sanction, they did it through the Highway Department. And they've used the Highway Department a couple of times. I'll tell you about the other one in a minute. What they told them is that if you have to decrease your speed limit to 55 miles an hour, or 65 miles an hour on the expressway. If you do not, there's a pretty heavy penalty that you're going to have to pay, and the penalty was something like, I don't know, like 10% or something. I mean, it was kind of a heavy-duty penalty, because that's a lot of money, saying we're just not going to give you that money if you don't comply with lowering your speed limit. And so the states lowered it, and for a long time, as I said, it took forever to get anywhere. I mean, you can imagine a state the size of Texas, how long it took to get anywhere, right? Anyway, so then and I remember so clearly it was in 1995 that it happened, because I was doing some research down on the border, and I had to go to a meeting in Mexico, and it was like on the other side of the Arizona border. It was in Nogales. And so I flew into Phoenix, and from there I drove down to Nogales. And so the speed limit had just changed. And so the speed limit at that time for that stretch over there, it was like 80 miles an hour. And it just seemed like so fast when you're used to going like 55 or 65 at the most. 80 seems so fast. But anyway, so there's still, a small penalty that states want to do that. But they're saying it's worth it. It's worth it for our people. They want to go ahead and be able to get to where they need to go. Okay, so the other way that they use the highway money is regarding the drinking age. Because it used to be that the drinking age was 18, and so they saw that there were like way too many accidents, because the younger people, like around y'all's age, were getting drunk and they were driving. So they said, no, y'all need to the states need to raise their minimum drinking age to 21. Otherwise, again, we're going to sanction the money coming in, for highways. And so the states didn't want to do that. So all of the states, and they eventually made it a constitutional amendment, a U.S. constitutional amendment. Drinking age was decreased to 18, that you cannot drink to 21, that you can't drink until you're 21. So that's called a crossover sanction. Okay, so these things called direct orders, we call them mandates. And so many times what happens, when I was talking to you about Reagan and his 3D program, I told you that the way that the states had to comply and are still doing the same thing right now, is that if there's a standard, I mean, federal level standard, national level standard, and if the federal government is not going to give them the money to comply with this particular program or this particular standard, then the states are the ones that have to pick it up. And so the states are mandating that they have to do it, but if they're not giving them the money or there's not much money, then it's considered to be an unfunded mandate. And there are many, many, many things that are coming in as unfunded mandates, especially in terms of the environmental protection. That, you know, and when it comes to the direct orders, it's mostly when it comes to the scrubbers, it's mostly when it comes to the coal and power plants, it's mostly when it comes to the large lobbies that really, or large industries, I should say, you know, power industries that lobby the government to keep these levels low. And so the problem with especially environmental policies at this particular point in time is that the policies are there. There's been a rollback of environmental policies. You know, the Clean Power Act went by the wayside when Trump took office. It'll probably change back, you know, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, so those are direct orders. So that's these are some of the ways that the federal government you know, makes the states comply with what they want. So this is the way that it comes down to the funding for the states. The states need to adopt the standards, as I said, and they need to be at least equivalent to the levels of the federal government, the ones that are instituted. They have limited funds to support these state actions, so the states are left holding the bag, and they're the ones that come up with money. Now, the first part, when I say that they need to adopt the standards at least equivalent to the federal government, those of the federal government, I said a minute ago they could request a waiver. And for example, one of the things that California did, because they have had such high levels of smog, is that they would get waivers to make their air cleaner. And they did this by using, to decrease their CO2 levels. And they did this by requesting waivers and, you know, using different types of strong, more, you know, higher levels of technology, of catalytic converters, that type of thing. And so they had to request it from the government. And so they did this for years and years and years and years up until 2020. And so they were no longer granted that waiver status. And so, you know, as I said, this is probably going to be changing sometime soon. Texas is not as progressive as California. Texas has never requested this kind of waiver. But really, when it comes to Texas, you know, we have the refineries, and Houston is the one that gets hit the most. In a way, we're lucky that we live here in the coastal bend because we also have the refineries, but we have a really strong trade wind that blows all of that pollution elsewhere. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about then is that the money part of it. And as you're watching the storm, be listening to this, to where the money is coming from and how it's coming down and what they're using it for. And there's a couple of ways that fiscal federalism is issued, or how the money comes down. And so for all of these, as I said a little bit ago, the money goes to the state treasury, but the states get money back. And so there's many different ways that it can come back. One of them is based on the census. I think I may have mentioned that before or not. I don't know. I'll tell you now. When the census is taken, and it's 2020, and the census is being taken in 2020, then depending on how many people are living in a state, we get some of that money back, and that's called formula funding. And so that's why it's kind of a big deal that every single person be counted, because what they use that money for, the formula funding money, is for things such as like education, for things like senior health care, for things like just basic health care if you're like an indigent. So they use it for many different things, school lunches, that type of thing. So so that's why they're saying it's so important that everybody be counted. So that just comes automatically based on your population. Another way the federal money, fiscal federalism comes down, or federal money comes down, is based on what are called categorical grants. And so these are based on the population for one thing, but they're also based on a certain project, a category, a project that's going to be taking place. And so some of these examples of categorical grants could be the highway money, the funding that was coming down, say, to build a highway, like when here in this particular area, when the JFK Causeway was being built. That's the one that goes over to the island. You know, the state got money from the federal government, from the U.S. Department of Transportation to TxDOT, and so TxDOT said, okay, you know, we'll pay some of it, but you cities have to finish paying the rest of it. So let's talk about that. Okay, so what happened is that around that time when the JFK Causeway was being built, because of bridges, and the reason that it was being built is they said it needs to be elevated because it's too low lying. That whole area floods out every time that there's heavy rain or if there's a hurricane coming. They would tell the people in the island, you need to get off the island or just stay, you know, stay and ride it out or whatever, because we cannot come get you. And because the JFK Causeway is one of the main routes out off the island, and there are a lot of tourists, they felt that this was necessary. But around that same time, the Crosstown Expressway was also being built, which is probably even a more traveled, more heavily traveled roadway than the JFK Causeway. But they said you cannot use it for the crossroads. You can only use it for the JFK Causeway. So they have like less discretion. So there's strings attached, and that's what it's called, strings attached. And so there's going to be matching funds that are going to be required. For example, the U.S. Department of Transportation gave Texas 75%. But based on the 75%, they said, okay, Texas, you have to come up with either 25%. And the state of Texas said, well, we'll come up with the 15%, but city and county, you need to come up with the other 10%. And so that's kind of how they divvied up the money in order to get a project like that, infrastructure built that way. Okay, then we have like different types of project grants. And so these are grants. Let me see, how can I say? If you work for the federal, for any level of government, there's not a whole lot of money coming down. But what happens is that you have to submit a grant to get a particular project going. And so these project grants do have more administrative discretion. I mean, you could do more things with these types of grants, but they're going to be kind of smaller. But there's also going to be a matching fund. Let me give you an example of this one. Well, for a while, there was some money that came down for, I think it was about animal control, especially for in this area. We have a bad issue with, well, for two things. A lot of pit bulls running around, and then a lot of stray cats running around. And so the university and the city in general, actually the city and then the university applied to the city like a pass-through to get money for the university to catch and release the program, the feral cats, and to fix them and, you know, take them back to their habitat, their community, or whatever. So that was just like an example of a project grant. They had to apply for it. As I said, it was money coming down from the federal government to fix a certain issue, a certain problem. It goes to the city. The university applied to the city to get this. So there's so much that goes on in public agencies at this particular point in time that's grant related. And sometimes it's not always the federal agency, or I'm sorry, the state agency or a public agency that will administer or implement these programs. A lot of times they might be contracted out. So the job of the public official, the person working in the public agency, their job has shifted a little bit, where now there's a lot more you know, project management, if you want to call it that. You have to kind of monitor the grants that are coming, that you let out to different you know, entities, to make sure that they are not wasting the money and that they're spending it the way that it should be spent. So in that way, you know, the role of a public agent has changed a little bit. Okay, then we have these things called block grants. And so the block grants are basically, again, there's another matching funds required. And so these are a lot of our welfare type programs. And so we have the TANF, which is the welfare, it's called, I don't remember, it's something about needy families or whatever. Okay, I don't remember what TANF stands for, but it was like the old welfare. So it's that one. Their community development block grants is community policing. They are the CHIPS programs. So what happens is that the federal government will give Texas a block of money, like we'll talk about the TANF, the welfare one. And so they'll say, okay, Texas, you're going to be getting this amount of money for welfare, but you get to decide how much each of your recipients is going to be receiving, because each state has a different amount of money that they grant to these women that are receiving welfare. Okay, and so in this one, they'll say, we'll give you 90% of the money, but state, you have to come up with the other 10%. So that's the matching funds. So there's always matching funds. Okay, community development is basically a blighted area or some type of area, like when I was talking about Clinton and his particular empowerment zones. It kind of falls under this one. So there were community development block grants to fix up a part of town, and that kind of money can be used for many things. It can be used for roads, it can be used for housing, it can be used for parks. There's a lot of discretion with that. And the last one is the community policing. And so the community policing, again, it comes in one of these block grants. That one's changed a little bit. They kind of like redefine how it's going to be divvied out through another agency or another way to divvy it out. But when it was coming into the block grants, what would happen is that the city, again, the federal government paid for 90%, and the city paid for, the city itself, and this would just pay for the 10% because it was, a city level. Police are all city level. And so the police are out in the communities. I mean, if you ever go by and you see someone like at the Stripes or the 7-Eleven or whatever, a policeman, it's because that's where their station is. That's their office. Because the thinking behind that one is that if there's more presence in the community, that it'll deter crime. Or if there is a crime, it'll be quicker for the police to respond to that crime if they're already in that neighborhood and they don't have to come from whatever station or substation. Now, that kind of dried up in one way. I found out just recently that they're gearing back up to have more type of community policing type of programs. But in the meantime, there was this hiatus of, I would say, like maybe 4 or 5 years where there was no money, no federal money coming down. And so the city asked the voters, if you want to have the city continue this community policing program, are you willing to pay for it? And so the city voted it in yes, because we thought it was a good idea. So part of that sales tax that you pay for your city taxes or your sales tax when you buy something, a small part of that goes for community policing. Okay, so this is kind of the way that it breaks down. All right, so many of the matching funds are basically 75% federal and 25% state and local. The other type, the ones that are more like welfare related, they're 90% federal and then 10% state and local. And so the example, and I gave you the highway example already, and so I gave the example of welfare, but CHIPS is a children's health insurance program. That's kind of basically the same thing. There are all these welfare related types of programs, and the CHIPS is a healthcare program.